Good morning, everybody. Welcome. So we're following on with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students today, and the Mishnah we're going to do is a long Mishnah. So don't get excited about trying to get through the entire Mishnah in a single setting, because I'm not convinced that we're going to manage to do that. So we're probably going to split it between this week and next week. Let's say by way of introduction that half of this Mishnah, the half that we'll look at today, are things that you really should do. And half of the Mishnah, which we'll reserve, please God, for next week, are things that you really should not do. So it's always good to start, I suppose, first with the things that you should do. Now bear in mind that there's a flow. The flow is that we were introduced to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai 2 Mishnahs ago. And we were told some of these basic principles, the idea that we are created to learn Torah, and therefore we shouldn't take personal credit and get all full of ourselves if we actually live up to that expectation. Then in the previous chapter, we were introduced to his 5 outstanding students. And that's going to become the theme, not the previous chapter, the previous Mishnah. That's going to become the theme for these next few Mishnahs. So we learned who they were. We were given a character reference for each of them. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and this is important, by the way, I'm reviewing it because it's relevant to this Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was this absolutely solid, watertight cistern. Whatever he learnt, he retained forever, never forgot it. Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, we said his mother is the one who is praised. Ashrei Yoladetoi. Happy is the one who gave birth to him. Rabbi Yossi HaKohen was called a chassid. A chassid is somebody who lives beyond the requirement of the law. Rabbi Shimon ben Asano Yirei Chet. Rabbi Shimon ben Asano was somebody who feared the prospect of sin itself. He wasn't worried about the consequences. He was afraid of the sin itself. And we said Rabbi Lozer ben Aroch, he was Kamayon HaMizgaber. He is like this incredible gushing flow of information, like a spring that bursts its banks and becomes a raging river. And then we said that there's an advantage to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who retains everything, and there's an advantage to Rabbi Elazar ben Aroch, who teaches in the most incredible way. Now, once we know those 5 characters, based on that, we're going to learn in this Mishnah 5 different approaches to personal development. So you can see how it's going to align. And the question we have to ask ourselves in each of these is, what's the link between the individual speaking, based on the character reference we were given in the previous Mishnah? So what's the connection between who they are, what their personal spiritual life experience was, and the particular teaching that they teach? Then, in the second half of the Mishnah, we're going to have each of those 5 come back and teach us something to avoid. Then at the end of the Mishnah, they're all going to collaborate on 3 principles for life. And then the next few Mishnahs will have each of them individually teach us something significant in our development. So that's why it's so important for us to remember the characters and to try and remember their respective characteristics, because that will help us understand why they say what they say. So with that in mind, let's have a look. This is Mishnah Yud, Mishnah 10 of the 2nd chapter of Pirkei Avos. Amar Lohem. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to these 5 students, who are these most incredible, outstanding personalities, and so therefore he wants to get their views on certain critical things. So he says to them, Tze'u ure'u. Go out and see Eizohi derech toiva, what is a good path, sheyidbak ba ha'adam, that a person should cleave to. Now, if we've learned anything during the course of our Pirkei Avos studies, the one thing you have to remember is that the Mishnah is word perfect. Nothing's used just because we wanted synonyms. You know how it is, writers often like to use different words so it doesn't sound repetitive and boring. The Mishnah doesn't do that. So the wording that is used is not for dramatic effect. The wording that is used is not to create poetry. The wording that is used is specifically chosen. So before we get into what they respond to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, let's ask ourselves, what was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asking them? So there are 2 things that should jump out at you in this particular phrase. First of all, Tze'u ure'u. What does that mean? Go out and see. Why doesn't he just say, tell me what you think? Or why doesn't he say, go learn, do some research, and once you've done that research, come back and tell me what you found. Tsu'u, go out of what? Go out of where? Ura'u, and it sounds almost like, and if you go out of whatever it is that you have to go out of, then you'll see what you need to see. So that's the first question we have to ask. What's this phrase, tsu'u, ura'u? The second thing that we have to wonder about is, what's this sheyidbak ba ha'adam? The correct path that a person should cleave to. You probably remember that at the beginning of this chapter, the very first Mishnah we had Rabbi Oimer, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught, Eizehi derech yeshara sheyavor loy ha'adam. What is the correct path that a person should choose? So that means we've already discussed this. We already worked out what's the correct path. And Rabbi told us, Kol shetiferes lo yiseha v'siferes lo mina adam, that the way that you know that it's the correct path is if it brings goodness and beauty to you, the practitioner, and to other people as well, and that you should be conscious of the fact that whatever you do has an impact on high, etc. So we already know what the path is. Why is he asking again? Derech toiva. So here he says a good approach, not an upright approach. And now he says sheyidbak, that you should cleave to. What's the difference between choosing and cleaving? Okay, so those are the two questions we have to address before we even get into the 5 approaches. You know, it reminds me a little bit of the Pesach Seder. I think you always got to be very, very careful when, speaking to certain crowds, because if you say Pesach too close to Pesach, then people start to panic. But now it's safe. Where before Hanukkah, it's still safe to talk about Pesach. So what does it remind me of in the Pesach Seder? If you go to the Pesach Seder, you'll see that it says, Tzei ulamad. Go out and learn what Lavan, it's actually from this week's parasha, what Lavan Ha'arami, Lavan the Aramean wanted to do to Yaakov, our forefather, because Paroi only wanted to destroy the males, and Lavan wanted to destroy everything. Bikash Lavan la koras hakol, he wanted to uproot the entire Jewish nation before it would even start. So there also it says, Tzei ulamad, go out and learn. So what's this going out? Going out of where? One of the most interesting things we're going to learn, generally, not just in this Mishnah, it's a rule of thumb, it's a golden rule of Judaism, is that the only way to learn, and that's why it says Re'u, there's different ways you could learn. There's ways that you could learn information where you say, okay, listen, I read something, I heard something, it was interesting, I file it away under a particular topic. And I think that's a lot of what we do when we learn. We have like this filing cabinet in our minds, and we say, okay, that goes under the parenting topic, that goes under the shalom bayis topic, that goes under the when I'm allowed to criticize my fellow Jew because he doesn't do exactly what I want topic. We kind of we file things away in places. But when you see something, it's very compelling, it's very real, it becomes kind of tangible. So the ultimate kind of learning is the kind of learning that you see things. You don't just record information in your mind, but you see it. It becomes clear to you. So if you want to see things, what you need to do is tsu'u. You first have to go out of your preconceptions. That's probably one of the most challenging things that we have when we try to learn, is how to unlearn. You know how often it happens? Think about if you've ever thought this way. How often it happens that a person learns something in a shiur and then turns around afterwards to the person who gave the shiur and said, but I always thought. Right? Ever done that? Ever heard somebody do that? But I always thought. Well, that's exactly the point. That's why we learn. Because what we always thought is not necessarily correct. The chap of learning is tsu'u. You get out of what you think you know, so that you can now see something that you previously really didn't know. So that's one explanation. There's another very interesting explanation, which is tsu'u. You know where it says that? It says that when Hashem came to Avraham and he promised Avraham that he was going to have a child, and Avraham says, what's that? It's not possible. What does the Torah say there? Vayotzei oisoi hachutza. Hashem took Avram outside and he said, Habeitna hashamayma, look at the heavens, and count the stars, if that's even possible. And then Hashem says to him, so will your descendants be like the stars. Now what's interesting about it is it uses the word habeit. Habeit actually is an expression of looking from a high vantage point down at something. So based on that, the Gemara tells us that Hashem told Avram, when it says, Vayoytzei oisoi hachutza, and he took him outside, he was saying, Tzei me'itztagninus shelcha. Step outside of your predetermined astrological reality. And Rashi even uses the expression, he says, Avram, your personal name up until this point, was incapable of having children. But Avraham, the new name that he was going to be given, he can have children. In other words, become somebody completely different. So what's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai telling his students? He says, if you want to learn, we're going to talk over here about the derech tova, the correct path that a person should follow in life. Before you can follow the correct path, go out of your predetermined nature, which basically means in simple English, you know how it works. We read something, we learn something, we go to a shir, we hear something, we come across something, and we say, I don't think I'll ever be able to do that. I know myself, I know my nature, it's how Hashem created me, I have this very unique Yetzer Hara. By the way, nobody else out of the 7 billion people on this planet has the Yetzer Hara that I have. Anybody else could grow and develop. It's just me, I have this unique problem of this particular, and if you knew how tough my Yetzer Hara was, you would not only not be critical of me, you'd be supportive of me. And you'd all gather around and say, Nebach shame, somebody has such a terrible Yetzer Hara. So what does he say? Tzu'u. If a person wants to learn, and especially if you want to learn in a way of re'iyah, that the things that you learn are as compelling and real to you, as if you saw it with your own eyes, well then you have to be willing to break out of everything that you believe to be your limitations. The insurmountable spiritual challenges that we all claim to have. Tzu'u uru'u. Go out of that, and then you'll be able to grow, to improve, to become the person that really these different streams of advice will direct us towards. Okay, and if you think that that's all just maybe a little bit too highfalutin, pie in the sky kind of thing, so there's another interpretation. Tzu'u means when you go out of the yeshiva, you need to know that the behavior that you could use in the yeshiva is not necessarily going to be acceptable in a different environment. For example, the Gemara always tells us that kina soifrim tarbe chochma, that the envy that one student has of the other student will push them to grow. Because there's this envy, and they're vying for the position. Who's going to understand better? Who's going to ask the more profound question? Who's going to offer the better explanation? That's very healthy because it prods you along to learn more. But Tzu'u, when you go out of the yeshiva, Ru'u, you need to see that perhaps that's not acceptable behavior. So if that envy would then translate into the envy of, hey, I'm frummer than you are, or how many pages of the Gemara I've completed, how many pages have you completed, or worse, when it starts to get into the competition of what this one has and how much that one earns, so it says, Tzu'u. Remember, when you go out of the yeshiva, Ru'u, you've got to be able to see the world in a different way. And then he says, it's Eze derech toiva sheyidbak. Sheyidbak means that you've got to know which trait, which path should you connect with. Earlier on, when Rabbi told us, Eze derech yeshara sheyavor lo ha'adam, which is the path that a person should choose, there he was basically alluding to the fact that not every path is appropriate. So you have to choose one. Certain paths you have to deliberately choose not to follow because they're not good paths, they're not healthy paths. Over here, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells us right from the start, there are different, acceptable, genuine paths of serving Hashem. But different people are different. And unfortunately, what happens most of the time, a good portion of the time, is we compare ourselves to others. Oh, look at that person. If that's the way that they're doing things and that's the way that they're serving Hashem, maybe I need to do that in order to also be okay. So he tells us there are various derachim toivos, there are various good paths to follow. The question is, Eizei derech toiva sheyidbak ba ha'adam. You have to choose one path that is your personally resonant primary path of serving Hashem. That's not to discredit somebody else. It's not to, God forbid, suggest that the way that they're doing things is inappropriate. Their way is good. But this is the way that yidbak. This is the way that should become your priority. And that's why you will see that there are going to be 5 different paths, because we're dealing with 5 different characters to illustrate to us that depending on what kind of character you have, and depending which of these 5 personalities you resonate with the most, that will help you to determine which of the 5 paths is best suited for you. Not everybody has to follow the identical path. And we certainly should not be critical of somebody else who follows a different path to us. It might be one of the most important things that we have to remind ourselves as a Jewish community, and even as a religious community, an observant community. It's a mistake, unfortunately, that we make where we think my way or the highway. Like if you've got other minhagim, other customs, you daven out of a different book, you do things in a different way, you prioritize different parts of Judaism, something wrong with you. So what does he tell us? There are 5 genuine paths. And you have to work out which one you want to cleave to, which one you want to connect with in the deepest, most personal way. So with that introduction, let's see what each of them had to say. Rabbi Eliezer Oimer. Rabbi Eliezer, the famous Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, who we learned about, who had a father who did not appreciate at all the fact that Rabbi Eliezer wanted to learn Torah, and yet Rabbi Eliezer made this an absolute priority in his life, and subsequently went on to become this incredible scholar. And what kind of a scholar we said? That he was Bor Sud She'enoi Me'abe Tipa. He was this sealed cistern that never lost one drop of what he learned. So he says, Rabbi Eliezer Oimer Ayin Toiva. The secret of everything, the primary way in which you should serve Hashem, the so-called good path that you should follow, is to have a good eye. So we'll have to try and understand what is a good eye. Rabbi Yehoshua Oimer, Rabbi Yehoshua, who was described in the previous Mishnah as Ashrei Yoladotoi, that it was thanks to his mother that he became such a great person, and therefore she's so happy and she has so much nachas. So what is his take? Chaver Toiv. That the key to everything, all personal spiritual development, is to have a good friend. Notice he says it in the singular. One good friend can make all the difference. Rabbi Yossi Oimer, Rabbi Yossi, who was described in the previous Mishnah as being a chassid, somebody who was absolutely dedicated to always doing more than the law required. So he says, Shochein Toiv, that what's most important is to have a good neighbor. And straight away we're going to have to ask ourselves the question, good friend, good neighbor, which one would you imagine to have a better influence over your life? Your neighbor or your friends? It's quite an interesting nuance. We're going to have to explore the difference between the two approaches. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, who was described in the previous Mishnah as somebody who feared sin, he may very well give us the most interesting one of the lot. I'm not saying it's the most powerful of the lot, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has a view on that, but he gives us the most interesting of the lot. He says, Haroye es hanoilad, that the ultimate path to follow is to be conscious of outcomes. It's a very unfortunate thing. A big portion of today's world, people live in the moment. And a lot of people tell you it's a good thing to live in the moment, and perhaps it is. Except that many people don't think 2 steps ahead. So people don't imagine the outcome of choices that they make. And because of that, we have a lot of suffering in the world, because people just don't anticipate what the outcome would be. So therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon, the most important thing, haroya es hanoila, to be able to foresee the outcome of choices. Rabbi Elazar Oimer, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch says that the most important thing is leiv toiv, to have a good heart. Omar lohem. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, after hearing the 5 different approaches, he said, Roye anias divrei Elazar ben Aruch midivrechem, shebichlal devarov divrechem. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I have to be honest, I think everything that you have taught is absolutely valid. But I think the one that is the most powerful, the most encompassing of all of them is Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, who says that you should have a good heart. Because if you have a good heart, everything else will fall into place. Now, we've got to be really careful at this point, because I can imagine right now there are a whole lot of people nodding their heads wisely and saying, you see, told you so. The most important thing is to be a mensch, to have a good heart. But as we're going to discover, to have a good heart is not as simple as just being a nice guy. So let's take each of them and let's break them down and understand, what each of them is supposed to mean. Of course, in the order that they appear. And we're going to try and somehow relate it to what those individuals were all about. So what's an ayin tova? Let's start with the first one. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, who says that the path to spiritual development and growth is ayin tova, to have a good eye. Now, good eye, different interpretations are going to take us in different directions. So we'll start with the Bar Tanura in each case, because Rabbi Ovadia Bar Tanura is kind of the first go-to commentary on the Mishnah. So he says that what's an ayin tova? An ayin tova means the person who is able to look at what they have and say, I don't need any more. What I see is good. So such an individual will always be happy. Such an individual will not, this is quite interesting, the Bar Tanura says, such an individual will not chase things that are not really valuable. And such an individual will not be envious of others. So ayin tova, look at what you have with an appreciative eye. That's the one possible explanation. And by the way, that's such a good bit of information for us. Think about it, because remember, even though Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is going to favor Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, each of these is valid, and each of these speaks to us. In today's world, we're being challenged to, you should get one of those, you should try one of these, you should go to that place, have that experience, listen to that talk, read that book, apply this life skill. So we live our whole lives with this anxiety, oh my gosh, am I good enough? Do I have enough? Maybe I should try that. No, we can spin ourselves in circles. So ayin tova, in this interpretation, is an incredible, incredible virtue to have in our world. What I have is good. If I get something else, it'll also be good. If I have another experience, it'll also be wonderful. But what I have is good. The satisfaction of what Hashem has given us, amazing. However, some of the other commentaries say a little differently. For example, the Medrash Shmuel has some very interesting things on the Pirkei Avos generally. And he says an interesting thing. Ayin tova actually means generosity. That's the pasuk that says, Toiv ayin hu yevoirach. The person who has a good eye, Shlomo Melech says, he will be blessed. So there the impression of Toiv ayin, the Gemara in Sota tells us, is somebody who's generous. The person who's generous, that's the person who will be blessed. Likewise, we're told that Hashem gave the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe used an ayin tova, which means he was very generous to share the Torah with us. Because he could have just told us the salient points, and reserved this elitism of being the big scholar to himself. And he didn't. He went out and he taught everything that he had to everybody else. So ayin tova means generosity. So here's an interesting observation, very interesting observation. What do you think a person should do if they want to become a bor sud she'enoi me'abei tipa, which is the description of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, the person who is this solid cistern that never loses one drop of what he has absorbed? Or to put it in simple English, what should a person do if they want to become the premier scholar? Well, any thinking person who applies simple logic would say, lock yourself away. Don't let people waste your time, and study. Sink your head into the books as many hours a day as you possibly can. Learn without interruption, and that's how you will become a bor sud. You'll become this sealed, watertight container of wisdom and knowledge. Says the Medrash Shmuel, ayin tova, a generous spirit means that you're generous with your teaching. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus also became the rabbi of some very great students, including Rabbi Akiva, who learned to a certain extent under. So it sounds counterintuitive. You would think that the person who's dedicating so much time to the community would not have the time to consolidate his Torah as much as the person who's more hermit-like. That's the message Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus wants to teach us. It's brilliant. If you want to retain your own knowledge, the best method is to ensure that you share it generously with others. Brilliant. Don't think you're going to shutter yourself off from the world and that's going to protect your wisdom. It doesn't work that way. Hashem designed us with responsibility, just like you have responsibility to give tzedakah. If you have money and somebody else doesn't, you have responsibility to share wisdom if you have it and somebody else doesn't. And then, as the expression goes, Meir einei shneim Hashem. Then when a person teaches, Hashem illuminates the eyes of both. Not only the student is illuminated by the teacher, but the teacher's mind is illuminated as well. And that is how a person consolidates their knowledge. Very, very interesting. Now, the next two, Chaver Toiv and Shochen Toiv, are ambiguous, actually, if you think about it. Right? Rabbi Yoshua says that the most important thing is good friend. And Rabbi Yossi says that the most important thing is good neighbor. So what's ambiguous about that? Well, I'll tell you what's ambiguous. See, most of us, when we read this, we think the most important thing is to have a good friend. And it's of course important to have a good friend because unfortunately the nature of people is that we do not see our own flaws. We have personal bias. So we kind of overlook areas where we have to grow and develop. And we instead focus on other more convenient, lower hanging fruit areas. That's the nature of people. When you have a good friend, you know what a good friend is? A good friend is not somebody who tells you what you want to hear. A good friend tells you what you need to hear. So obviously it makes sense to say, Chaver Toiv, have a good friend. Because that's going to help you to develop and grow as a person. Likewise, Shochen Toiv. What's a Shochen Toiv? Why is a good neighbor really important? So the Bartanura says, well, the reason a good neighbor is important is because you could have a good friend, but the good friend might live far from you. And you may not have that person around whenever you need them, whereas your neighbor's always there, like it or not. So it makes sense to have a good neighbor because that will be a healthy influence on you. This is, of course, the reason why Jewish people like to live in Gan Hazel, right? Because you're kind of guaranteed you're going to have a good neighbor. So if you make sure that you have a good neighbor, I'll just throw in, by the way, if you try Strathaven, there's good neighbors too. So if you have a good neighbor, then consistently you've got somebody who's in your immediate environment who has positive influence even when the friend is not there. There's another reason for a good neighbor, another reason that it's so important to have a good neighbor. And that is that the nature of people, unfortunately, is that people tend to be a bit cynical. And when they see somebody who is ultra frum, because remember, Rabbi Yossi was the chassid, he's the person who lives beyond the requirement of the law. So people are going to see him and say, oh, you think you're so frum. Where did you get that particular behavior from? Or this particular hidur, or that particular chumrah, or whatever the case is. So that's why Rabbi Yossi, because he was so alert to the concept of how people react to somebody who's a chassid as he was, somebody who goes beyond the letter of the law, so he advises, stay in an environment where the people are supportive. Don't go to a place where the people will ridicule who you are and what you're doing. Now let's go back for a second to Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, because in the previous Mishnah we said, Ashrei Yoiladetoi, that the greatness of Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya is actually not even his own greatness, it's his mother's greatness. Happy is the one who gave birth to him. Well, you know what a chaver is, you know what a good friend is. Once upon a time, many years ago in a faraway land, lived a prince, right? That's usually how most people understand in the modern world what marriage is all about. It's all about romance, and it's all about how much you love the person, and that's how you get all these horrible expressions that people use today, about falling in love and falling out of love, and all this crazy kind of stuff that goes on. What does the Torah say? What do we say under chuppah? Samach to samach, reim ho'ahovim. Reim, you know what reim are? Good friends. You know what the secret of a marriage is? Chaver toiv. To have a person at your side who is your good friend. I'm not saying you don't love them. Obviously you love them. But it's a friendship. It's a deep, meaningful friendship where you care. Chaver from the word chibur, that there's connection. Connection of mind. You share ideals. You share values. You share aspirations. You share perspective on how your home should run, on how your children should be educated. Chaver toiv, says Rabbi Yeshua Hananya. I know that from personal experience. My mother was a chaver toiv. She was a good friend, a good partner, a good chibur, a good supporter to my father. And she took all of those ideals that he stood for and she put them into practice, and that's how I landed up who I am. But it's still ambiguous, you see. Because so far we've all been quite satisfied that both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yeshua are telling us, go out there and make sure that you find a good friend or a good neighbor, because that will help you to stay on the straight and narrow. That will influence and inspire you to connect. But maybe that's not what they're saying. Maybe they're saying the exact opposite. You want to progress and connect to Hashem. Make sure that you are a chaver toiv. That you should be the good friend. Actually, if you think about it, that's much more aligned with a Torah-based perspective. Because a Torah-based perspective is not to run around the world talking about your needs. I need a good friend. I need a good neighbor. That's not the Jewish approach. Could you imagine if Avraham Avinu would have run around his whole life saying, I need somebody who could support me? Well, there wouldn't be Jews today. The Jewish approach is to be proactive, to be the light to the world, to be the one who influences. So to be the good friend, or to be the good neighbor, or in that interpretation, to be the good spouse. Not to turn around and say, I would be a lot, but my spouse is not on the same page as me. Doesn't have the same values that I have. Well, you be the chaver toiv. That's what he's telling us, Rabbi Yeshua. You be the chaver toiv. You be the influence. There's an expression amongst Hasidim that the Gemara tells us, Ein mekoyma shel adam mechabdoi ela adam mechabed mekoymoi. So the Gemara says that a person's environment does not bring the person honor. Rather, the person brings honor to their environment. So the Hasidish is saying it's an ambiguous word, because the word kavod means honor, and the word kaved means heavy. So therefore the verb mechabdoi could mean gives you honor, or mechabdoi could make you heavy and dragged down. So the Gemara is telling us that the nature of a Jewish person is you don't blame your environment and say, my environment needed to give me the honor, my environment needed to let me go and instead it pulled me down. Adam mechabed makoymo. It is our responsibility to bring that honor to our environment. It's for us to be the chaver toiv. It's for us to be the shachen toiv. Really, really powerful message. Then you have Rabbi Shimon ben Asano. Rabbi Shimon ben Asano is, like I said, probably the most interesting of the lot in a sense. He's the one who said Yirei Chet. He was described as Yirei Chet, that he feared sin itself. So what does he say the most valuable thing to focus on is? Haroye es hanoilad. To see, now it doesn't actually mean consequences actually. The word noilad means to see what will be produced, what will be born. Like for example, later on the Mishnah is going to tell us that every good deed that you do produces a healthy angel, and every bad deed, God forbid, produces a dangerous angel, an accusatory angel. So he's saying Haroye es hanoilad, that you should be conscious of how your deeds, your actions produce living spiritual beings that then will have an influence and impact on your life. So that's Yirei Chet. He's fearful of the sin, not of the consequence that one day in Gehenna something's going to happen to me. The sin becomes a living entity that lives in my life. It becomes part and parcel of my reality. Also, the unfortunate thing is that sometimes your friend or your neighbor, even when you ask them for advice, and even when they have your best interests at heart, sometimes they don't see 2 steps ahead. And you cannot necessarily expect them to do so. So he hears what they're saying about the chaver tov and the shachen tov. He says, but you still, haroye es hanoilad, you still have to have foresight. It's that important that you're able to somehow envisage what's going to happen down the line. It's quite interesting because this exact phrase is used. The Gemara tells us that Alexander the Great came to the sages. Anybody who's familiar with the history of Alexander and the sages, it's fascinating. Their interactions were fascinating. So Alexander the Great asked the sages, Ezehu Chacham, what is the nature of a wise person? And they told him the same thing. Haroye es hanoilad. Wisdom is the ability to see what will happen. Many people think about what will happen. They scenario plan. He says, roye. You need to be able to see what is going to happen. So in other words, you don't just imagine what's going to happen, but roye, it's got to be clear to you as if it is something that you had seen in front of your eyes. But there's something else. And this is what is really, really interesting about this particular phrase. Haroye es hanoilad. Because there are various ways that we could have really said the same thing. If the message is, be conscious of and be awake to what's going to happen, there's so many ways. You should have said roye hatoitzois or whatever. I mean, there are many ways to say it. What is hanoilad? So here's something fascinating, really fascinating and really deep. It's a fundamental principle of Judaism that the creation of the world did not happen 5,781 years ago. The creation of the world happens at every moment. We say it in our davening, HaMechadesh b'tuvoi b'chol yoim tamid ma'aseh bereishis. That Hashem in His goodness renews every day consistently the entire process of creation. That means that the world is being reborn at every moment. It's a fascinating thought, and it's a very fundamental perspective in Judaism because, we talk about things that everything is bashert, and we talk about how Hashem is always close. But when we appreciate the concept that Hashem rebirths the world at every single moment, it will fundamentally change how we perceive everything. It will change how we perceive our decisions. If I think that Hashem is kind of divorced from the world, so, okay, whatever, I'll do something wrong now and it's okay because later on I'll fix it up. But if I recognize that Hashem is right now creating my reality right now, what a chutzpah. How dare I now do something which is contrary to what Hashem wants? I'm afraid to sin. As Rabbi Shimon says, Yiras chet. The fear is sin itself. How dare you, in front of Hashem who's currently recreating your whole reality, how dare you misbehave? Not because you're worried something will happen, but because you're so conscious of His presence that it's unthinkable to rebel against Him. That's Rabbi Shimon's message over here. That what is the secret of everything? Haroye es hanoilad. To constantly see in front of you that the world is rebirthed at every moment. Because that will shift everything that you understand. It will shift your perspective on pain and suffering. It will shift your perspective on responsibility and dedication. It will shift your perspective on your connection and distance or closeness to Hashem. Everything will shift. So he says that's the most important thing. And don't theorize about it. Roye. Work on yourself and work on yourself until it becomes as clear and realistic to you as the things that you see with your own eyes. Now, many of us might say that's a very high level to reach. I don't know. I mean, it's incredible. It's beautiful. It's very profound. But it might be a little bit of a high level for me. Much like yiras chet, fear of sin itself, might also seem a little out of reach for most of us. And that's possibly why it is that we settle on Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. What does Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch say? Leiv toiv. That the key of everything is a good heart. What does it mean, a good heart? So the Bartanura says very simply, the nature of the heart, the physical, anatomical nature of the heart is that it pumps energy to the whole body. So you've got blood coming into the heart and then it gets pumped out of the heart through the entire cardiovascular system, and that's how we live. Conceptually, for that reason, the heart represents the energy center that drives the whole human experience. What I care about, what I'm invested in, where my energy goes. It's all driven by the heart. So therefore the Bartanura says, if the leiv is toiv, if your heart is good, you actually don't have to battle through all the different details and nuances of every part of character. In other words, there are two ways that a person can grow and develop as a person. And it's quite important to know and to identify those two ways, because they take us to totally different places. The one way is that you go one character trait at a time and you try and fix them each, one by one. So if, for example, a person has an issue with arrogance, then you do a program to tackle arrogance. And that program might take a few years, might take a lifetime. And if the same person who's arrogant also is predisposed to laziness, well, there's a different program for laziness. And if it so happens that they also are tempted to certain behaviors which are not allowed by the Torah, well, there's another program for those behaviors. So it's kind of like doing, your masters in science and the arts at the same time. You're kind of pulling in different directions. But sometimes it's possible for a person to do a major, what they call in today's world, extreme makeover. Which means you get to the core of where does it all emanate from? What drives those behaviors? Because if I can shift the source that drives all of those behaviors, then the behaviors will naturally resolve themselves. So the Baal Tanura says that's Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Deal with the heart. Get your heart to be in the right place. In other words, care about the right things. Be passionate about the right things. The other details will fall into place. Just an example that we can all relate to. We know how difficult it is for a person to control themselves from speaking Lashon Hara, right? It's really difficult. For some people, more difficult than for others. But, it's not easy. Why? Because there's some times where we feel that this is a compelling story and it has to be shared. And there are other times that we're just stuck in the mood and everybody else around, whatever it is. Now, could you imagine if a person in their heart was incapable, imagine this, was incapable of feeling any of that resentment, envy, negativity towards the subject of the Lashon Hara, then you obviously wouldn't talk badly about them. Obviously. Because you don't feel badly about them. That's what Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch is telling us. Leiv ra. If we can work on ourselves internally, work on how we feel, what we care about, how we look at the world. Shlomo HaMelech says that the leiv, the heart, is actually the seat of bina, of understanding. How we understand the world. If our perception is altered at its core, the details fall into place. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, Roya ani es divrei Elazar ben Aruch midivreichem shebichlal dvarav divreichem. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, that's why I see the advantage to Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch over everything else that has been said, not because it is more relevant, more effective. They're all effective paths and they're all relevant paths. It's just that each of them requires us to focus on a particular area. And we'll master that area. So you'll master the area of the good eye, the generosity or satisfaction. You'll master the area of good friendship, or the area of good influence, the good neighbor, or the area of being able to perceive what's to come. But if you can shift and master the area of how you perceive the world and how you feel about the world and how you feel about Hashem and His Torah, then you really, really see incredible movement and development and growth in all the areas. What's a little frustrating about that approach is that you don't necessarily see the results immediately, because obviously if you're focusing on a particular area, it's quite easy to say, okay, I made this specific goal and I fulfilled it. Whereas over here, you're trying to shift a whole being. That's harder and less recognizable. But I suppose that's the same as physical growth, right? When the whole human being grows through the course of childhood, through adolescence to adulthood, you actually don't feel it happening. But everything is changing. And that's really the ultimate experience of, I suppose, of being Jewish, is to move ourselves at the core of our being so that, please God, everything else falls into place.